For several decades, Sony has had complete control over Spider-Man's film rights. With this power, they've made a number of decisions regarding the character that could be seen as both wise and foolish. On one hand, Sony has taken risks with their creative choices with the character, which has led to some successful adaptations like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and the Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, made possible by their willingness to work with an indie director who's never worked on blockbusters before. However, they have also made some poor creative choices, such as them fast-tracking a cinematic universe, ending in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 being terrible, meddling with Spider-Man 3 and Spider-Man 4, and recent releases like Morbius and the Venom series, showing that they don't really care about the quality of their films. So how did Sony obtain the film rights to Spider-Man in the first place? Let's take a look at the character's history of ownership and how the film rights eventually landed in the hands of Sony Pictures.
Welcome to Warping Fist.
To understand how Sony acquired the film rights to Spider-Man, we need to thank one person. His name is Mehem Golan, and although many have never heard of him, he's by far the most important figure to influence Spider-Man's cinematic trajectory. Before Sony's acquisition, Spider-Man was mostly limited to TV series, including live-action skits, animated TV shows, an ABC series, and a chaotic Japanese TV show. He also made occasional appearances in fan films, which at the time was one of the only ways to experience a comic-accurate Spider-Man in live action.
Sorry to drop in unannounced, Kingpin, but I've always been a party crasher.
Despite his widespread presence on TV, it was time for Spider-Man to make his big screen debut. This led to Orion Pictures acquiring the film rights in 1982, with Roger Corman as the director. This was not the first attempt to make a Spider-Man film, as producer Steve Krantz tried to make his own adaptation in 1976. Initially, he envisioned it as a stage play musical, but after abandoning the idea, he planned to adapt the seminal story The Night Gwen Stacy Died. However, this version included giant robots and neo-Nazis. Understandably, this version of Spider-Man was ultimately cancelled, and the film rights would revert back to Marvel. Orion Pictures acquired the film rights years later and hired Roger Corman as the director, who was a big fan of Spider-Man, so much in fact that he hired Stan Lee to write the screenplay. The story featured Dr. Octopus as the main villain and had themes relating to the Cold War. However, Corman and Lee had creative differences. Lee wanted to create an action-packed blockbuster, while Corman preferred a low-budget production like his other films. This disagreement resulted in the Spider-Man rights reverting back to Marvel once again, and Corman would go on to direct a low-budget Fantastic Four film. With a price tag of $225,000, Marvel would sell the Spider-Man film rights to Mehem Golan and Yoram Gobis of Canon Films. After Canon Films acquired the rights, they would begin work on their own unique interpretation of the character. Written by Leslie Stevens and directed by Tobe Hooper, the story would have centered on a man who would transform into a giant spider monster, waging war against an evil scientist and his army of creatures. Obviously, this approach to a Spider-Man film was not very popular. Due to this, the film underwent substantial rewrites. Stan Lee would create a new treatment for the film, a treatment that writers Ted Newson and John Brancato would adapt into a full screenplay. This new Spider-Man script, titled Spider-Man: The Adventure Begins, was much closer to the original source material. However, the unintended consequences of changing the original pitch to something more comic faithful was the exit of Tobe Hooper from the project, as he had no interest in making a traditional superhero film. Luckily, all was not in vain, as director Joseph Zito would be brought on to the project. Zito would fire Brancato and Newson due to them not including him in the scripting process, and would bring on a new writer, Barney Cohen, to polish the script, which now featured Dr. Octopus as the main villain. This Spider-Man film came very close to production, as Canon Films spent $1.5 million in pre-production to market and promote the film through posters, magazine ads, and newspapers. This film came so close to filming, in fact, that they began storyboarding the film. underwent special effects testing for Dr. Octopus's arms and Spider-Man's movement, and even began screen testing for the role, with stuntman Scott Leva being featured in many production and set photos.
Spider-Man, the movie. A live-action spectacular directed by Joe Zito, based on the characters created by Stan Lee.
Stan Lee himself even hoped to be cast as J. Jonah Jameson in the film. Unfortunately, Canon Films cut the budget from around $20 million to $7 million due to other projects. Zito's film now needed to accommodate this lower budget, which wasn't possible. Due to this, he'd drop out of the project, and the script would undergo major rewrites once again from several other writers. Many other pitches for a Spider-Man film would be presented, but these were never officially greenlit. At some point, the film changed so much that Canon Films finally buckled and shut down the production after Canon Films was bought by another company, Path Films. Although Canon Films was no more, that didn't stop Mehem Golan, one of the men who bought the Spider-Man film rights at the beginning, from once again reacquiring the rights for 21st Century Film Corporation. Golan would kickstart work on yet another Spider-Man film, using the original Brancato and Ted Nugent script. However, this script would once again go through several rewrites at the request of Columbia TriStar, a company that Golan sold the home video distribution rights to. This event is what would spark Columbia's longtime interest in the Spider-Man property, as they would offer to take over production of the film in order to spawn a multi-picture franchise. Despite Columbia's interest in the film rights and the possibility of it being sold to them, Golan was persuaded by another film company, Carloco Pictures, to sell the film rights to them instead of Columbia. Carloco not only offered a very high budget, but they also had the director James Cameron attached to direct. Golan agreed to sell the film rights to Carloco, as long as they agreed to credit him as a producer for the film. Golan had spent years trying to get the Spider-Man film off the ground, so he felt that it was only fair if he was acknowledged in some way in the making of the film. Carloco agreed to his terms and officially began work on a new Spider-Man film, with James Cameron brought on as the director. Several pieces of promotional material were made in order to promote this upcoming film. However, there was one small problem. Golan was not credited on a single piece of promotional material, as James Cameron refused to include his name, which in turn broke the agreement Golan made with Carloco about being credited as a producer. Golan would proceed to sue Carloco in order to forcibly take back the rights to Spider-Man. As a response, Carloco sued Viacom, the owners of the Spider-Man TV rights, and Columbia, the owners of the home distribution rights, in order to revoke their ownership. Columbia and Viacom, as a response, would then sue Carloco and Marvel. Golan would file a lawsuit demanding that he's credited for every Spider-Man film that would ever be made, and another company, MGM, would also sue, as they claimed that they owned the Spider-Man rights. Eventually, during all these massive legal battles, Marvel, 21st Century Film Corp, and Carloco would all go bankrupt, and MGM, who no longer could handle the immense cost of going to court, decided that every party involved in the court should settle. James Cameron at this point was still interested in directing a Spider-Man film, so he asked 21st Century Fox to buy the film rights from Marvel. However, not wanting to pay the hefty legal fees, 20th Century Fox failed to acquire the rights, leading James Cameron to be furious and finally exiting the project. Marvel would sell the film rights to Sony Pictures Entertainment in March of 1999 for a whopping $7 million. Sony would then trade the Casino Royale rights to MGM in order to acquire James Cameron's script, which MGM had ownership of at the time. However, they would not be adapting Cameron's script in its entirety. Instead, they would rewrite the script and keep some elements present. Many directors were approached to direct the film, such as David Fincher, who pitched a darker film that took inspiration from the night Gwen Stacy died. However, him and other directors would never get their films off the ground. It was not until Amy Pascal approached Sam Raimi to direct that this film would finally get off the ground. Sony was now the first studio among dozens to get a Spider-Man film off the ground, one that was a massive critical and financial success. It was clear now that this was just the beginning of Sony's tight grip on the franchise that they hold on to even to this day.